My name is Erica Larsen. I am 36 years old, and I'm a veterinarian at a small animal clinic in St. Paul, Minnesota. For 10 years, my sister-in-law Tara ran my grandmother's bakery, and for most of those 10 years, I was glad someone capable was doing it, because I'd built a career of my own and didn't have the time or honestly the desire to spend my days behind a counter. I trusted Tara. I trusted my brother Nick. And for 10 years, that trust meant I never asked to see a single piece of paperwork. Then, 3 weeks before the bakery's 50th anniversary, I got an email from a property management company I'd never heard of, asking me, as a co-trustee of my grandmother's estate, to review and sign a lease assignment document for a deal I knew absolutely nothing about. That email is the reason I'm telling this story today, and it's the reason that, as of about 2 weeks ago, my relationship with my sister-in-law looks very different than it did before. Before I get into it, if you're new here, I tell stories like this one most days, true stories about families and the quiet arrangements inside them that nobody really examines until something forces them to. If that sounds like your kind of thing, go ahead and subscribe and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I read all of them. Okay, let me take you back to the beginning. My grandmother, Astrid Larsen, opened a small Danish bakery in the Linden Hills neighborhood of Minneapolis in 1976, when she was 31 years old. She'd emigrated from Denmark with my grandfather in the late 1960s, and the bakery, she called it simply Larsen's, with a small painted sign that's still there, repainted a dozen times over the decades, but always the same lettering style, became, over 50 years, something close to a neighborhood institution. Kringle on Saturdays, a particular rye bread that people drove across the city for. A back room where, for as long as I can remember, there was always a pot of coffee on and a few of the same regulars sitting at the same small table every single morning for decades. I grew up in that bakery, in the sense that my mom, Astrid's daughter, worked there part-time when I was a kid, and my brother Nick and I spent a lot of after-school hours doing homework at that same backroom table, surrounded by the smell of cardamom and yeast. Nick loved it in a way I never quite did. By the time he was a teenager, he was already learning the recipes from our grandmother, learning the rhythms of a 4 a.m. start, and it was never really a question that Nick would end up running Larsen's someday. I loved animals instead. I spent my after-school hours, when I wasn't doing homework at that table, volunteering at a vet clinic 2 blocks away, and by the time I left for college, in 2008, everyone in my family understood that I was going to be a veterinarian, and that Nick was going to be a baker, and that this division of our lives was about as settled as anything in our family ever was. My grandmother had a particular way of talking about the bakery that I didn't fully appreciate until much later. She never called it my bakery. She called it the family's bakery. Even back when it was legally just hers, even back when Nick and I were small kids who contributed nothing to it but noise and the occasional flower handprint on the front window. She used to say, in the accent she never really lost even after 50 years in Minnesota, "A bakery is not a building. A bakery is a list of names." She meant the regulars she could tell you, off the top of her head, which of the men at the back table took their coffee black and which took cream, whose birthday was coming up, whose daughter had just had a baby. But I think she also meant something about her own family, about Nick and me, about the idea that whatever happened to that building, the bakery itself was something that belonged to all of us, in a way that didn't need a deed or a contract to be true. I think about that phrase a lot now, a bakery is not a building, a bakery is a list of names, because in a strange way, it ended up being almost literally true in the events I'm about to describe. The building itself was never really the issue. What was at stake was a name, Larsen's, and a list of people. 50 years of regulars and family and recipes, and whether all of that could simply be sold off to a company that had never met any of them. My grandfather died in 1998, before I was old enough to really remember him well. My grandmother ran Larsen's on her own for the next 22 years, well into her 70s, with Nick gradually taking on more and more of the day-to-day as she slowed down. She was diagnosed with dementia in 2017, when she was 72, earlier than most people, which her doctors attributed partly to a series of small strokes, similar in some ways to stories I've heard from friends about their own parents and grandparents. By 2019, she could no longer safely work in the bakery, though she still came in most mornings, sat at the back table, and greeted the regulars, many of whom she'd known for 40 years and still recognized even as so much else faded. She died in early 2020, at 75, a few weeks before the world more or less shut down for the pandemic, which meant her funeral was small, just immediate family, something that still feels unfinished to me, all these years later. My grandmothers will set up a trust that owned the bakery business and the building's long-term lease. She'd never owned the building outright, but had held the same below-market lease since the 1980s, renewed every 10 years with the same family of landlords, the Pelletiers, who'd owned the block since before Larsen's existed. The trust named Nick and me as co-trustees and equal beneficiaries, 50-50, which made sense to both of us at the time. Nick would run the bakery day-to-day, as he'd been doing for years already, and I would be, essentially, a silent partner. I'd receive half of any distributed profits, and any major decision, selling the business, assigning the lease, anything structural, would require both of our signatures as co-trustees on actual paperwork. For the first couple of years after my grandmother died, this arrangement worked exactly as you'd hope. Nick sent me a check every quarter, usually somewhere between $1,000 and $1,800, depending on how the bakery had done, along with a short email summarizing how things were going. I'd respond with something supportive, maybe ask how he and Tara and the kids were doing, and that would be that. I had, by then, just finished my veterinary residency and was working long hours building up my own practice. The quarterly check from Larsen's was genuinely one of the lowest maintenance parts of my life, and I was grateful for that, in a season when almost nothing else felt low maintenance. Tara came into the picture more fully around 2021. She and Nick had been married since 2014. She'd worked in marketing for a regional grocery chain before that, and after my grandmother died, Tara left her marketing job to help Nick run Larsen's full-time. This made a lot of sense on paper. Nick had always been the baker, the person who knew the recipes and the ovens and the early morning rhythms, but he'd never been particularly interested in the business side: pricing, scheduling, supplier contracts, social media, the stuff that increasingly mattered for a small bakery trying to stay relevant. Tara was good at all of that. Within a year or two, Larsen's had an Instagram account with a real following, a redesigned logo that kept the original lettering but cleaned it up slightly, and a line out the door on weekend mornings that, from what Nick told me, hadn't existed since maybe the late 1990s. I want to be fair to Tara here, because I think it matters. She's good at what she does, and a lot of what kept Larsen's not just alive but thriving over the past several years is genuinely because of her. The quarterly checks I received went up. By 2023, they were more often $2,200 to $2,800. I told Tara more than once how impressed I was, and I meant it. At a family dinner a couple years ago, I remember saying something like, "Honestly, I think you've done more for this place in 3 years than anyone has since Grandma was in her prime." And Tara had seemed genuinely pleased by that, the way anyone would be. The thing I didn't fully notice, looking back, is how the language around the bakery slowly shifted over those years in casual conversation, at family dinners, in the captions under Instagram photos. It went from Larsen's, Astrid's bakery, to our bakery, to, more and more often, just the bakery, what Tara's built. I don't think this was some calculated rebranding effort, not at first. I think it was just the natural way people talk about the thing they pour their daily lives into. But I also think, looking back, that this slow linguistic shift mirrored something else that was happening underneath it, something I had no way of seeing from where I was. I remember one family dinner in particular, maybe 2 years ago, where Tara was telling a story about a regular customer, an older man named Mr. Pearson, who'd apparently been coming to Larsen's since the 1980s and had recently started bringing his granddaughter in on Saturdays. Tara told the story warmly, in detail, the way you'd tell a story about someone you genuinely cared about. And at some point in the story, my mom said, gently, almost as an aside, Astrid would have loved that. She always said the bakery was really just a long list of names. Tara nodded, said something like, "That's exactly it," and the conversation moved on. I didn't think anything of it at the time. It was a nice moment. But I think about it now, because it's one of the only times in those years that anyone, including me, explicitly connected what Tara was doing to what my grandmother had built it to be. Most of the time, the bakery's present and its past existed in slightly separate conversations, and nobody was really standing in the gap between them, making sure the two stayed connected to each other. I should explain why I was so hands-off, because I think it's relevant. My own career, over this same period, was demanding in ways that left very little room for anything else. I'd taken on an ownership stake in the veterinary clinic where I worked in 2022, which meant on top of my regular caseload, I was suddenly dealing with staffing, equipment loans, insurance, an entirely new layer of responsibility that ate every spare hour I had. My husband, Mark, and I had also just had our first kid in late 2022, which anyone who's had a baby while also taking on a business ownership stake will understand, left essentially zero bandwidth for anything beyond. Is everyone alive and fed today? So when Nick or Tara would mention something about the bakery, a new oven they were financing, a renovation to the front counter, an extra part-time hire, I'd say, that sounds great and mean it, and not think much further about it. I trusted that the business side of things was being handled by someone who was good at the business side of things. And I trusted that, as co-trustee, I'd be looped in on anything that actually required my input, because that's what the trust document said was supposed to happen. I want to be honest. I never once in 5 years asked to see the bakery's books, or the lease, or any of the trust paperwork beyond the original documents from when my grandmother died. Not because I was told not to. Just because nothing ever seemed to come up that required it, and asking felt, in some vague way, like it would imply I didn't trust Nick and Tara, which, until 3 weeks ago, I genuinely did. There's one more piece of context that I think matters here, which is my own relationship with money and ownership, generally. I'm the kind of person who, even at the veterinary clinic I co-own, tends to let my business partner handle the financial side, because numbers stress me out in a way that animals never do. I can stay calm during an emergency surgery on a dog that's bleeding out, and feel my hands start to shake looking at a spreadsheet with too many columns. My husband Mark actually used to tease me about this. He'd call me professionally fearless and personally terrified of Excel, which fair. So when it came to the bakery, a business I had even less day-to-day connection to than my own clinic, the idea of asking pointed questions about financing and lease terms felt, to me, like wading into a kind of conversation I'd actively spent my whole adult life avoiding. I think that's worth naming, because it wasn't only that I trusted Tara. It was also that not asking was, for me personally, the path of least resistance. And paths of least resistance are exactly the kind of thing that other people, even people who love you, can end up quietly relying on. The 50th anniversary of Larsen's was always going to be a big deal. 50 years is 50 years. And Tara had been planning some kind of event for almost a year, from what I understood. There was talk of a weekend celebration, a special edition of my grandmother's original recipes, maybe some local press. I'd been looped in on the date. The celebration was scheduled for a Saturday in early July, and Tara had asked, a few months back, whether I'd be willing to say a few words at the event as Astrid's granddaughter, which I'd happily agreed to. About 3 weeks before that date, on a Tuesday morning, I got an email. It came from a property management company called Heartwood Realty Partners, a name I didn't recognize at all, with the subject line lease assignment, action required. Larsen's Bakery, Linden Hills. The email was addressed to me by name, identified as co-trustee Astrid M. Larsen Family Trust, and asked me to review an attached lease assignment document and return a signed copy at your earliest convenience, prior to the scheduled transition date of July 15th. I remember reading that email standing in the break room at the clinic, between appointments, with a half-eaten granola bar in my other hand. I genuinely thought, for a second, that it must be some kind of mistake, a misdirected email, maybe meant for someone else with a similar name. I opened the attached document anyway, mostly out of curiosity. It was not a mistake. It was a lease assignment agreement, transferring the existing Larsen's lease, the below-market lease the Pelletier family had renewed with my grandmother, and then with the trust for decades, to a company called Hearth and Rye Collective, LLC. There was a second attachment, an asset purchase agreement, in which the Astrid M. Larsen Family Trust agreed to sell the trade name Larsen's, associated recipes, branding materials, and goodwill to the same company for $480,000, with the existing bakery to close no later than August 1st, so that Hearth and Rye could begin a renovation and relaunch under their own brand, with, and I remember this detail specifically, because it was almost funny in a horrible way, an option to retain the name Larsen's as a sub-brand, at Hearth and Rye's sole discretion. If you've ever opened an email that completely rearranged what you thought was true about your own life, even for just a few minutes, type "wait" in the comments. I want to know how common this actually is, because in the moment, it felt like one of the strangest experiences of my adult life. I called Nick immediately. It was about 10:30 in the morning bakery hours, which meant he should have been there. He didn't answer. I called again 20 minutes later, between my next two appointments, and this time he picked up, and I could hear the bakery in the background, the espresso machine, voices. "Hey, what's up?" he said, in a completely normal tone, and something about that normalcy made my stomach drop even further than the email already had. "Nick, I just got an email from a company called Heartwood Realty about a lease assignment and an asset purchase agreement for Larsen's to a company called Hearth and Rye for $480,000, closing August 1st. I tried to keep my voice level. "Do you know anything about this?" There was a pause, not a long one, maybe 2 seconds, but long enough that I knew, before he said anything, that the answer wasn't going to be, "What?" "No, that's insane. Let me look into it." "Okay," Nick said slowly. "Okay, so yeah, there's been some conversations with Hearth and Rye about a possible Erica. I think this is a conversation we should have in person, not on the phone while I'm." "Nick, the document I'm looking at requires my signature as co-trustee. I've never seen it before today. When were you planning to have this conversation? Another pause. Tara said she'd already talked to you about this. Like months ago. She said you guys had talked about it and you were on board, you just wanted to stay out of the day-to-day details. I sat down on the floor of the break room. I want to be clear about why. Not because I was about to faint, nothing dramatic like that, but because my legs genuinely felt like they weren't going to hold me up while I processed what I'd just heard. Tara had told Nick, and I'd learn over the following days, had told several other people, including at least one of the bakery's longtime suppliers, that I had already agreed to this. That conversations I had never had, about a deal I had never heard of, had supposedly already happened, with my supposed blessing. After I hung up with Nick, I sat on that break room floor for what was probably only a couple of minutes but felt much longer, and then I called Mark. He was at home with our daughter, who was 3 at that point, and I could hear her in the background asking him something about a puzzle piece while I tried to explain, in a voice that I don't think was as steady as I wanted it to be, what had just happened. "Wait, back up," Mark said. "Tara told Nick you'd already agreed to sell the bakery's name to a company you've never heard of. For, what did you say, $500,000? $480,000. My half would be $240,000. And you've genuinely never discussed this with anyone?" "Never, not once. I didn't even know there was debt, Mark. I thought things were going well, better than ever actually, that's what they kept telling me." Mark was quiet for a second. Then he said something that ended up sticking with me through everything that followed. "Okay, I think the first thing you need to figure out isn't whether Tara lied, it sounds like she did, and that's real, and you're allowed to be upset about that. But the bigger question is what you actually want to happen to the bakery itself. Because I think if you go in there angry about the lie, you're going to end up making a decision about the bakery based on the lie, and those might not be the same decision." I didn't fully appreciate how right that was until later. In the moment, I just remember feeling grateful that someone was helping me separate two things that, in my head, had become completely tangled together. The fact that Tara had said something untrue about me, and the actual question of what should happen to a 50-year-old bakery that was, depending on how you looked at it, either thriving or quietly drowning, possibly both at once. I left work early that day, something I almost never do, and drove to the bakery. I want to describe what it felt like walking in because it stayed with me. It was early afternoon, past the morning rush, and the bakery was quiet in that particular late afternoon way, just a couple of people at tables with laptops, the smell of that day's bread still in the air. Tara was behind the counter, going through receipts, and when she saw me, her expression did something I'll never forget, a flicker of something like recognition, immediately smoothed over into a warm, slightly surprised smile. "Hey, this is a nice surprise. Everything okay?" "I got an email today," I said, "from Heartwood Realty, about Hearth and Rye." The smile didn't disappear immediately, but something behind it did. "Oh, okay, yeah, I was going to Nick, and I were going to sit down with you about that. We just wanted to wait until we had more concrete numbers before." The email had a document that needs my signature. As co-trustee, for a sale that's apparently supposed to close in 3 weeks. "Tara, I have never had a conversation with you about selling Larsens. Not once. Why would you tell Nick, and apparently other people, that I had?" I want to describe Tara's face in that moment as honestly as I can, because I think it matters for understanding what happened next, and for understanding Tara as a person, not just as an antagonist in a story. She didn't get defensive, not right away. She looked, more than anything, tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time and finally setting it down, even if setting it down meant it was now visible to everyone else too. "Can we sit down?" she said. It wasn't really a question. We sat at the back table, the same table where Nick and I had done homework as kids, where my grandmother used to sit with her coffee every morning, and Tara told me, in pieces, what had actually been happening. Before she got into the numbers, though, she said something I wasn't expecting, which was that she wanted to start by telling me about a morning about a year and a half earlier, early 2025, when the walk-in refrigeration unit failed overnight and they'd lost almost their entire weekend's worth of inventory, right before a big weekend they'd been promoting for weeks. "I called Nick at like 5 a.m., she said, and he sat down on the kitchen floor. Just sat down, right there, and didn't say anything for a long time. And I remember thinking, I cannot tell him how bad this actually is, on top of everything else, because I don't think he can carry one more thing right now. So I just told him I'd handle it. And I did handle it. I got us through that weekend. I got the insurance claim filed. I found a used commercial fridge from a restaurant that was closing in St. Paul, all of it. But somewhere in there, 'I'll handle it' stopped being a thing I said about one bad morning and became kind of my whole job. The thing I did instead of telling people how bad things actually were." Larsens had been doing well publicly. The Instagram following, the weekend lines, all of that was real. But the bakery had also taken on significant debt over the past few years. The new ovens Nick had mentioned to me, financed through a small business loan. A renovation to the kitchen after a refrigeration unit failed catastrophically in 2023, which insurance had only partially covered. And Tara admitted, a period during the pandemic recovery years when the bakery had operated at a loss for several quarters, which they'd covered using a line of credit secured against, and this is the part that made my stomach turn, the trust's lease itself, used as collateral, something that, as co-trustee, I should have been informed about and asked to approve and wasn't. The Hearth and Rye deal, as Tara explained it, had come about because the line of credit was coming due. The bakery didn't have the cash to pay it off, and Hearth and Rye, a regional chain that had been buying up heritage, independent bakery brands across the Twin Cities and relaunching them under their own operational model, had approached them with an offer that would clear the debt, pay Nick and Tara a substantial transition bonus to stay on as brand consultants for a year, and net the trust $480,000 for the name and recipes, of which my half would be $240,000. "I know how this looks," Tara said. "But Erica, we were drowning. The loan against the lease was my idea, and I take responsibility for that, but I also didn't know what else to do, and I didn't want to call you in the middle of your maternity leave and tell you the bakery might not survive the year. I thought I could fix it quietly, and I thought by the time the Hearth and Rye deal came together, I'd convinced myself it was basically good news. Debt gone, money for both of us, the name keeps going even if it's not exactly the same. I told Nick you were fine with it because I didn't think you'd actually object to the outcome. I just didn't think you'd want to be bothered with the details. I was wrong. I know I was wrong. I shouldn't have said you'd agreed to something you'd never even heard of." I asked her how long the Hearth and Rye conversations had actually been going on. She said it had started almost 8 months earlier. A representative from Hearth and Rye had come into the bakery as a customer, recognized the name from some Best of the Twin Cities roundup article, and asked, almost casually, whether Tara had ever considered franchising or licensing the brand. That casual conversation had turned into a few meetings, then a formal offer, and somewhere in that 8 months, Tara said, the idea had stopped feeling like a hypothetical and started feeling like the obvious answer to a problem that had been quietly growing for years. "Once you're inside something like that," she said, "it's hard to explain how normal it starts to feel. Every meeting, it felt like the next logical step from the meeting before. And by the time the actual paperwork showed up, telling you about it felt less like, here's an update, and more like, here's a confession. And I kept finding reasons to put it off. I asked her, too, why she hadn't told me about the line of credit against the lease when she first took it out, 2 years before any of this. She didn't try to make it sound smaller than it was. Because I knew what the trust document said, she told me. I knew it needed both of you to sign off on anything like that, and I knew if I asked, you'd say yes. You'd have said, yes, Erica, I really believe that, but it would have meant a conversation and paperwork, and you knowing the bakery was in trouble, and at the time it felt so much easier to just do it and have it be a non-issue by the time anyone needed to know. And then it just never became a good time to bring it up. There was never a good time. And the longer it went on, the more it felt like bringing it up at all would mean admitting I'd been keeping something from you for years, which I had been. I just didn't think of it that way at the time. I thought of it as protecting everyone from a problem I was going to solve before it mattered. Here's something worth pausing on. Only about 3% of people who watch videos like this one ever actually subscribe. If this story has you wondering what happened next, that small click helps this channel keep finding stories like Erica's. Okay, back to it. I drove home that night and didn't sleep much. The next morning, I called an attorney, a trusts and estates lawyer named Mr. Whitfield, who'd actually helped my grandmother set up the original trust documents back in 2019 and who I'd met exactly once at the reading of her will. He still had the file. He confirmed what I'd already suspected from reading the trust documents myself the night before. Any sale or assignment of trust assets, including the lease and the trade name, required signatures from both co-trustees, with no exceptions, and any loan secured against trust property above a certain threshold required the same. The line of credit Tara had taken out against the lease 2 years earlier had technically been done without proper authorization, though Mr. Whitfield was careful to point out that technically unauthorized and legally void weren't the same thing, and unwinding it might be more complicated than simply declaring it invalid. What was much simpler legally was the hearth and rye deal itself. It could not close without my signature. Full stop. Whatever conversations had or hadn't happened, whatever Tara had told Hearth and Rye's representatives about my supposed approval, the actual legal mechanism, the piece of paper that made the sale real, required something that did not exist: my agreement. You have more leverage here than you might feel like you do, Mr. Whitfield told me. The question isn't really, can they do this without you? They can't. The question is what you want to happen instead. He walked me through the original trust documents page by page. Documents I'd technically signed years earlier, at the reading of my grandmother's will, but had never really read with any attention, the way I imagine most people don't read the fine print of documents handed to them in the middle of grief. The language was clearer than I expected. No sale, assignment, encumbrance, or transfer of any trust asset, including but not limited to the leasehold interest and any intellectual property associated with the business known as Larsen's, shall be valid without the written consent of both co-trustees. My grandmother, or more likely, my grandmother's own attorney back in 2019, had built in exactly the kind of protection that was now standing between Nick and Tara, and a deal that was 3 weeks from closing. There's something else worth understanding, Mr. Whitfield added, which is that the line of credit Tara took out against the lease 2 years ago without your signature exists in a kind of legal gray area. It's not automatically void just because it was improperly authorized, because the bank likely relied on it in good faith. But it does mean that if this ever became contentious, if, Say, you wanted to argue the trust shouldn't be bound by a debt one co-trustee took on without the other's knowledge. You'd have real standing to make that argument. I'm not saying you should. I'm saying you could, and I think it's useful for you to know that going into whatever conversation you have next, because it changes the shape of the negotiation, even if you never bring it up directly. I asked him point blank what he thought I should do. He smiled slightly, the kind of smile lawyers give you right before they tell you they can't actually answer that. I can tell you what's legally possible, and I can tell you what's legally required. I can't tell you what you want for your grandmother's bakery. But for what it's worth, in 20-some years of doing this kind of work, the people who end up at peace with these situations are rarely the ones who used every piece of leverage they had. They're usually the ones who used enough of it to fix the actual problem, and then put it down. That question sat with me for a few days. I want to be honest that there was a version of this where I could have simply said no, refused to sign anything, let the line of credit default, let the consequences land wherever they landed, including potentially on Nick and Tara personally, since I later learned Nick had also personally guaranteed part of the loan. Some part of me, in the rawest moment right after finding out what had happened, wanted exactly that, wanted Tara to feel the full weight of having told people I'd agreed to something I'd never heard of. But the more I sat with it, the more I kept coming back to my grandmother, to 50 years of a small painted sign in Linden Hills, to a back table where 2 generations of our family had done homework and built a life around a place she'd started with almost nothing. Whatever Tara had done, and I don't want to minimize it, because telling people I'd agreed to a $480,000 sale I knew nothing about was a real breach. Not a small one, the bakery itself. The actual thing my grandmother built was still there, still busy, still making the same rye bread people drove across the city for. Blowing that up to make a point felt like it would hurt the wrong things. So I went back to Nick and Tara with a different proposal, with Mr. Whitfield's help to structure it properly. I would not sign the hearth and rye deal. The sale of the name and recipes was off the table, permanently, as far as I was concerned, regardless of what it meant for the debt. But I would agree to restructure the line of credit myself, using some of my own savings, plus a personal loan against my share of the clinic, to pay it down to a manageable level, converting it from an emergency liability into a normal, properly documented business loan, co-signed by both Nick and me as it should have been from the start. In exchange, the trust's ownership structure would be formally updated. I would take a more active role going forward, not running day-to-day operations, but with real, regular visibility into the books, cop it on financial decisions above a certain threshold, the way the original trust documents had always intended, but had quietly stopped happening somewhere over the past few years. We met to go over all of this, Nick, Tara, Mr. Whitfield, and me, at Mr. Whitfield's office, a week after my conversation with Tara at the bakery. I'd been bracing for that meeting to feel tense, maybe even hostile, but it ended up being one of the more straightforward conversations we'd had as a family in years, precisely because, for once, everything was being said out loud, in front of a third party, with documents on the table instead of assumptions in the air. Nick, for his part, admitted that he'd known, in some vague way, that things had been tight, his word, for a while, but had let himself not ask follow-up questions, partly because he trusted Tara completely and partly, he admitted, because he didn't really want to know. "I think I did the same thing you did, Erica," he said at one point. "Just from the other side. You didn't ask because you trusted us. I didn't ask because I didn't want to find out I should be worried." There was one moment in that meeting that I keep coming back to. Mr. Whitfield asked Tara, fairly directly, whether she understood that the new arrangement meant giving up a level of unilateral control she'd had for years, that going forward, Decisions she might once have made on her own in an afternoon would now sometimes mean waiting for an email back from me, possibly for a day or two, before moving forward. Tara thought about it for a moment and then said something that surprised me. Honestly, I think I've been waiting for someone to ask me that question for a long time. Not, are you okay with giving up control, but just, anyone noticing that I had all of it in the first place. Nobody really responded to that right away. It just sat there in the room for a second, and then we moved on to the next page of the document. We also talked, in that meeting, about what would happen with the $480,000 question. Not the Hearth and Rye deal itself, which was dead, but the underlying fact that the bakery, as a 50-year-old business with a below-market lease and a loyal following, was apparently worth that much to an outside buyer. Mr. Whitfield raised, gently, whether Nick and Tara had ever considered what it would mean for their own long-term plans, if neither of them ever wanted to retire from a business that, on paper, represented a meaningful chunk of both of our eventual inheritances tied up in something illiquid. It wasn't a question anyone needed to answer that day, but it was the first time I think any of us had actually said out loud that keep the bakery in the family forever. And the bakery is also, eventually, going to need some kind of plan for what happens when none of us can run it, were two different ideas that we'd been quietly treating as the same one. The anniversary celebration happened as planned 3 weeks later, on that Saturday in July. Hearth and Rye was not mentioned, not by us and, as far as I know, not by them. Mr. Whitfield's office sent a formal notice that the trust would not be proceeding with the proposed transaction, and that was, apparently, the end of it from their side. Companies like that, I gather, have a dozen of these deals in motion at any given time, and one falling through isn't a crisis for them the way it would have been for us. I did say a few words at the event, as Astrid's granddaughter, standing at that same back table, now moved temporarily to make room for a small crowd. I talked about my grandmother's rye bread, about the cardamom smell I associate with my entire childhood, about how strange and wonderful it was that 50 years after a 31-year-old immigrant opened a small bakery with a hand-painted sign, that same sign, repainted a dozen times, but always the same lettering, was still hanging there, with a line out the door on a Saturday morning. I didn't mention any of what had happened in the weeks before. It didn't seem like the moment, and honestly, it still doesn't feel like a story I need to tell publicly in that way, which is part of why I'm telling it here instead, to people who don't know any of us. At one point during the event, an older man came up to me, one of the back table regulars, someone I vaguely recognized from childhood but couldn't have named, and told me he remembered my grandmother teaching him, back in the early 1980s, how to tell when the kringle dough had proofed long enough just by pressing 2 fingers into it. He demonstrated the gesture, right there, slightly embarrassed, and said, "She told me, if it springs back like this, it's not ready, you want it to spring back like this," and pressed his fingers into the air twice, with 2 very slightly different amounts of pressure that, to be honest, looked identical to me. But he remembered it, 40-some years later, exactly the way she'd shown him. I thought about Mr. Pearson's granddaughter, and about that list of names my grandmother used to talk about. And for a moment the whole thing, Hearth and Rye, the lease, the line of credit, all of it, felt very far away, like something that had happened to a different bakery entirely, in a different city, to people I didn't know. Things between Tara and me are not the same as they were before, and I don't think they're going to go back to exactly what they were, and I've made some peace with that. We're not estranged. We still see each other at family dinners, at my kids' birthday parties, all of that continues. But there's a formality now, around the business specifically, that wasn't there before, and I think that formality is actually healthier than what we had, even though it's less warm. I get a monthly financial summary now, not just a quarterly check. I'm copied on supplier contracts above a certain dollar amount. None of this is punitive, exactly. It's just what should have been happening for the last 5 years and wasn't, and now is. Nick and I have talked more honestly, too, about the years he spent not really wanting to be the business side person, and how much he'd quietly let Tara absorb that role without either of us, Nick or me, really checking in on whether that was sustainable for her. I think Tara was genuinely overwhelmed for a long stretch of time, and I think the lie she told, that I'd agreed to the sale, came from a place of exhaustion and a kind of magical thinking that's easy to judge from the outside and much harder to avoid from the inside. When you're the only person holding something together and you're terrified of what happens if you ask for help and don't get it. Looking back on all of this now, here's what I keep coming back to. The first thing is about the words we use, casually, about shared things. Our bakery became Tara's bakery so gradually that nobody, including me, ever noticed the shift happening. And by the time it mattered, the language had already done some of the work of making a sale feel like Tara's decision to make, rather than a decision that belonged to all three of us. I don't think words alone caused what happened, but I think they made it easier, and I'm more careful now about noticing when ours quietly becomes someone else's. The second thing is about the difference between trust and oversight. I trusted Nick and Tara completely, and in a lot of ways, that trust was earned. They genuinely grew the business, genuinely cared about it. But trust and oversight aren't substitutes for each other. You can trust someone completely and still ask to see the books once a year. I didn't for 5 years, and the absence of that small, low-stakes habit is what let a 5-year-old loan against my grandmother's lease go completely unnoticed by me until it nearly cost us everything. The third thing is about what protecting someone actually looks like. Tara told me she didn't want to call me during my maternity leave with bad news, and I understand that instinct. I think most people have had a version of it, the desire to shield someone you care about from something stressful. But protecting someone from bad news isn't the same as protecting them from the consequences of that news, and those consequences arrived eventually regardless. They just arrived bigger and more entangled, and with less time to address them carefully. The fourth thing is about my grandmother, and about what the bakery actually was underneath all of this. For a few weeks, Larsen's was a line item in a purchase agreement, a trade name, recipes, goodwill, $480,000. But it was never really those things. It was a hand-painted sign repainted a dozen times. It was a back table where 2 kids did their homework while their grandmother poured coffee for the same regulars she'd known for 40 years. No amount of money was ever going to be a fair trade for that. And I'm glad, in the end, that the math worked out in a way that meant I never had to find out what number I would have said yes to. And the fifth thing, the one I think about most now, when I stop by Larsen's on my way to work and grab a coffee at that same back table, is that 50 years is a long time, and most of it happens quietly, in ways nobody's paying close enough attention to notice until something forces the issue. I got lucky, in a strange way. An email from a property management company I'd never heard of, 3 weeks before a milestone anniversary, forced the issue before it was too late. Not everyone gets that kind of accidental warning. I think, going forward, the goal isn't to never trust anyone again. It's to build in the kind of regular, gentle attention that means you don't need an accident to tell you something's wrong. A few weeks after the anniversary, I stopped by the bakery on a regular Tuesday morning. No event, no occasion, just a coffee on my way to the clinic. Tara was behind the counter, and she'd started keeping a small printed binder near the register, the kind of thing that hadn't existed before. weekly numbers, supplier invoices, a running list of anything above the threshold that now needed both of our sign-offs. She caught me glancing at it and said, half joking, "It's not as scary as it looks." I told her I knew. We talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular, my daughter's daycare, an order of cardamom that had come in slightly late, and then I took my coffee to the back table, the way I have most weeks since, and sat there for a while before heading to work. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear from you. Has your family ever had a shared thing, a business, a property, anything, where you realized, all at once, how differently everyone had been thinking about it? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. Thanks so much for watching and for sitting with Erica's story today. I'll see you in the next one.